Merhaba. Hello and welcome to City Breaks Valletta, Episode 5, Art, Architecture and Archaeology. A longish title, a pot-pourri of an episode, featuring all three of those topics which it's as well to keep in mind when you are out and about in Valletta. I'm Marion Jones. So this, as they never say in football, is going to be an episode in 3 halves. I'm going to start with art, focusing mainly on the National Art Gallery in Valletta, but with a mention too of 3 artists connected to Malta in various ways, and of the 2 most famous paintings on the island, which are in fact not in the National Gallery of Art. Architecture-wise, I'm going to run through some of the features to look out for as you wander the streets of Valletta, and talk briefly about 3 different phases, historic periods, which you can spot if you keep your eyes open out and about in Valletta, and give examples of each for you to look out for. And finally then a brief section on archaeology, based mainly on the National Museum of Archaeology in Republic Street. An idea of some of the things there are to see there, and references to things around and about the rest of the island which you might choose to go and visit. So, to begin with art, and the Musea, which is the Maltese name for the National Art Museum. A very clever name, I discovered, because there are at least 3 reasons why it's exactly the right name for this gallery. So firstly, those 4 letters, M-U-Z-A, are an acronym in Maltese for the words National Art Museum. And then there's the fact that it's linked to the word muse, and also, would you believe, Musea as a Maltese word apparently means mood or inspiration. And it is indeed an inspiring gallery to visit. Firstly because, as mentioned in previous episodes, it's in one of Malta's most beautiful buildings, one of the auberges, but also because it is full, as you might expect, of Maltese art. Right from the very first room, in fact, where you'll see portraits of Maltese characters. Mari the egg seller, a goat herd, a fisherman, and where on the back wall there's a big colourful mural entitled Maltese Crafts and Trades. Very eye-catching, lots of bright colours, representations of all kinds of activities typical of Malta, so fishing, spinning cotton, weaving, selling vegetables. The more you look, the more you see. Further on in the museum you'll see lots of other very Maltese scenes. Seascape by George Fenwick, for example. Another one called Imported Grain, which shows local men unloading goods at the dockside, with a view of Valletta in the background. Plenty of paintings of places in Valletta, many of them done in the 18th century, so Palace Square, for example, a view of the 3 cities, a lovely painting of St John's Church, portraits too of former grandmasters and other people connected to the island, not least actually Winston Churchill, painted in 1954 in recognition of his unwavering support for Malta during the Second World War. There's a section called History of Art in Malta, which takes you chronologically through lots of different eras, and highlighting the fact that there have been so many different influences on the art in Malta because of the waves and waves of immigration from different areas that have come to the island over the centuries. So you'll see, for example, bits of Roman mosaic. You will see medieval and Renaissance paintings, mainly religious, and you will see in the Maltese modernism section more scenes from around the island. A harbour scene, for example, a horse-drawn cart. There are little sections on various artists connected to Malta, 3 of whom I'm going to highlight. The most important one being Mattia Preti, whose dates are 1613 to 1699. He was Italian by birth, studied and worked in Italy for many years, but in his 40s came to Malta, where he was appointed as one of the knights, and where he spent the rest of his life, so another 40 years or so. And the reason he's so well known is because he's the artist most connected to St John's Cathedral. He was in fact appointed to oversee a 20-year project transforming the inside of the building. The outside is relatively plain, but they wanted something much more opulent inside, and Mattia Preti designed and in fact executed much of what you see in there today. So he it was who thought, let's have gold and blue pillars, and he it also was who painted the 18 scenes from the life of St John onto the ceiling, painted them straight onto it apparently. Look out too in the nave for his enormous painting St. George on Horseback, which is really very striking. Anyway, back in the museum, paintings of his include The Martyrdom of St. Catherine and another one of Judith holding the head of Holofernes. You can see his works actually in many of the big galleries across Europe, in the Prado in Madrid, for example, in London's National Gallery, at the Uffizi in Florence, at the big art museum in Vienna. I think globally he's definitely the best known of the three artists featured here. And the second artist I wanted to mention is a Maltese sculptor called Antonio Schiottino, born in 1879. The opposite of Preti, really, in that he was Maltese but spent much of his life in Italy. Although he returned to Malta as curator of the Maltese Museum of Fine Arts, so the predecessor of the Musa, for the last 10 years of his life before he died in 1947. There's an exhibition of his work here entitled A Maltese Artist in Rome, and his most famous work is here, A Study of Three Children, based on Les Miserables. And if when you see it, you think you've seen it before, you may be right, because in fact there's a copy of it in the Upper Baracca Gardens. One or two more of his sculptures are here, and also here lots of the models for his work. So sculptures of a Maltese Prime Minister, for example, another one of one of the Grand Masters, one of the Russian playwright Chekhov, and another of England's King George V. There are more examples of Schiottino's work out and about in Valletta. For example, in the Upper Baracca Gardens, you can see his statue of Lord Gerald Strickland, Prime Minister of Malta in the 1920s. And another artist who has his own little section here, entitled A British Artist in Malta, is Victor Passmore, dates 1908 to 98. Labelled here as a pioneer of abstract art, a man who moved to Malta when he retired and set about becoming very much part of the art scene on the island. I have to say I didn't particularly warm to his work. I think I'd categorise it as lines going for a walk, so very abstract. But I would say it's worth having a quick look because it will help you decide whether you want to visit another gallery in Valletta, the Victor Passmore Gallery, which houses a permanent exhibition of his works, most of which he created while he lived in Malta. It's just around the corner from the Musa, in fact, in the square where the Jean de Valette statue is. So very easy to fit into your itinerary. I can't finish the art section without talking about the two best-known paintings in Valletta, the two Caravaggio works, which you'll find in the oratory in St. John's Cathedral. So Caravaggio arrived in Malta in 1607 when he was about 40 years old, and despite his turbulent history and extremely roguish reputation, he was appointed as a Knight of St. John. In return, he worked on the painting, The Beheading of St. John, destined to be an altarpiece, and in fact the largest painting he ever did. It is a dark, gruesome work about dark, gruesome deeds, depicting the scene of the death of St. John the Baptist, as told in the Bible. So King Herod has demanded the execution of John the Baptist because a servant girl has asked him for his head on a platter, and the painting captures the moment when this was carried out. St. John's lying on the floor, the executioners bending over him, dagger in hand, the prison governor's there issuing orders, and a servant girl is standing waiting with a golden platter to carry away the head. In the dark background on the right of the picture, you can just see two more prisoners watching in horror. This painting was the only one Caravaggio did, which he signed, and gruesomely he painted his name in red, as if it were written in the blood spilling from John the Baptist's throat. The painting hangs exactly where Caravaggio painted it, and in fact a few months later, when he'd fled the island and he was defrocked in absentia on the charge that he was, quote, a foul and rotten member, the little ceremony at which this was decided took place right here in front of the painting. A quotation which I came across which seems to sum up the painting is from a journalist called Jonathan Jones, who wrote, quote, "Death and human cruelty are laid bare by this masterpiece." The second Caravaggio painting here is a smaller one, St. Jerome writing. It shows the elderly St. Jerome writing in a book. He's translating the Bible from Greek to Latin, and the right-hand side of the painting where he sits is bathed in light. On the other side of the table, on the left, sits a skull, just looking on and watching him. Another painting, I think, that once you've seen it, you're not going to forget. Moving then from art to architecture, a good place to start is to mention that the city of Valletta in its entirety is a World Heritage Site. And here's a quotation which tells you why. Valletta itself is an architectural masterpiece, surrounded by the towering and majestic fortifications built by the Order of the Knights of St. John. It is a treasure trove of architectural beauty, containing beautiful Baroque buildings, spectacular palaces, impressive churches, stunning theatres, and picturesque gardens. So the motto really is wander and wonder. But a handy checklist of things to look out for, which are typically Maltese, would include the limestone walls. Limestone is an abundant material on Malta, and much of it was used then for the buildings, which gives the city a unity. So too do the wooden doors, which you'll see everywhere. Rainbow colours, reds and deep ocean blues, greens and yellows, they're really quite a feature. And you'll notice too, on townhouses owned by better off people, often giant brass door knockers, all sorts of shapes, including really quite often a door knocker in the shape of a fish. And the thing that will probably strike you most of all, the balconies, which have their origins in Arabic traditions, sometimes a little box sitting on the house facade, sometimes a peephole, so that women could look out without being seen. The older balconies are the open stone ones with balustrades around them, often examples of beautiful wrought ironwork. But then gradually they became closed balconies, so a wooden box frame added on to the front of the building, often rectangular but sometimes curved, and typically painted, most usually in that bottle green colour that you'll see everywhere. As for the inside of the buildings, what to expect? High ceilings often, a real sense of airiness and space, very light inside. Flagstone floors in the oldest buildings, but in newer ones dating from, let's say, the last 300 years, patterned tiled flooring, an idea copied from Spain, large square tiles with floral designs or sometimes geometric motifs, which almost make the room look carpeted. And spiral staircases, known as garrigors, very traditional. They start in the basement, they wind their way up to the roof. In fact, we had one in the building where we stayed. More generally, as you walk around Valletta, there are different eras of architecture that you can notice, the first one being the Knights of St. John, who, of course, started from scratch and built the city. So look out for their fortresses, the bastions around the Grand Harbour, the coastal forts of St. Elmo or St. Angelo. Then there are their palaces, the 8 auberges, one for each of the orders of knights, and the jewel in the crown, the Grand Palace, the Grand Master's Palace. And, of course, because they were a religious order, the churches. So the first church they ever built, Our Lady of Victories, and the standout beauty, St. John's Cathedral. I've talked about that in some detail already, but I haven't really properly mentioned the other standout beautiful building, namely the Manuel Theatre, commissioned by a Grand Master in 1731, and inside stunningly beautiful. Think 3 tiers of wooden boxes all decorated with gold leaf, and a pale blue trompe-l'œil ceiling that looks like a round cupola. A Grade 1 listed building, and one which you can look round if you go on a guided tour, or of course go to a performance. The second era would be 1814 to 1964, the period of British rule in Malta. And the buildings they left behind, which you can visit today, include the National Library at the top of Republic Street, a large, impressive building with a statue of Queen Victoria on a plinth outside. And then there's the Covered Market in Merchant Street. You might find it marked on the map with its Arabic name, which I think is pronounced Souk Talbelt. And there you will find a 3-storey covered market, a bit like the ones the Victorians built in London. Worth a look architecturally, and also a good place to top up your supplies if you're food shopping, or indeed in search of a restaurant. In the 21st century, though, Malta has gone in for a big contemporary architecture project. Actually, 4 different projects, all clustered around the Parliament end of Republic Street, and all the work of the architect Renzo Piano. So firstly, there was the reinforcement of the ramparts and the ditch all around the city, and across it then a new city gate, just 8 metres wide and built across a gap in the city walls. Architecturally, I've seen it described as very restrained. It's a large plain archway, no decoration at all, which gives off an impression of strength and austerity. Thirdly, there's the Parliament House, built and opened I think in 2015. Again, very modern, 2 big blocks connected by bridges. One's the chamber, one's the admin block. Up to date in that it's a zero-emission building and in that it's plain and simple, and yet fitting in with the context of the city because it's built of limestone. And with a nod to Maltese tradition, the facade is decorated with a honeycomb effect, a reference to the fact that the bee is a symbol of Malta. And the fourth part of the project, just up the road again, is the redevelopment of the old Royal Opera House after the bomb damage from World War II, where Renzo Piano decided to merge what was left of the original structure with just enough new build to turn it into an open-air theatre space. Another example of something built very recently is the Baracca lift, which will take you up and down a height of about 20 stories in a glazed carriage from which you will have panoramic views over the city and the harbour. And perhaps you will use it to get down to the cruise passenger terminal and the waterfront, which is another example of the revamping of a heritage area. In this case, the conversion of the old warehouses into a line of restaurants and cafes, keeping some of the traditional features such as the coloured doors which told illiterate sailors of old which goods to store where. And to finish the episode, a word about archaeology, because Valletta is home to the National Museum of Archaeology, whose website promises, quote, a spectacular collection from the Maltese Islands prehistory and early history. The National Museum of Archaeology is definitely your first step to understanding the richness of the land you tread on, its people and their ancestors. This is another museum housed in a former auberge, the Auberge de Provence this time, in Republic Street, and in addition an absolute bargain of an entry price, €5 maximum. Inside you will find 3 main periods are covered, starting with the Neolithic period, with information about the megalithic temples, of which there are 7 in total on the islands. So you can see, for example, the altar from the Hagar Queen temple. See photographs and information about the digs when these places were discovered. And, most movingly I found, see some of the artworks crafted by inhabitants of the island up to 7,000 years ago. Carvings from the temples, perhaps. A little clay figure of a woman called the Sleeping Lady, lying in a skirt, naked from the waist up, just caught in that moment of having a little doze. Or so I thought, although the information panel did say there was a question over whether perhaps she was sleeping the eternal sleep of death. Either way, to stand and look at something modelled by human hands so many thousands of years ago was fascinating. And there were little fat stone figures too, a bit like garden gnomes. Again, who knew? Then there's a section on the Bronze Age, showing how a completely new civilization arrived on the island. No more temples, much more of an emphasis on fortified settlements and weapons. They imported metal ore and made axes and knives. And evidence too of daily life, so spindles and loom weights showing that there was a textile industry. Little bell-shaped pottery jars for storing water and grain, jewellery made of fish bones and shells and pottery. And then a final section on the Phoenician period, so the 8th to the 6th century BC, when seafarers and traders came to the Maltese Islands. One of the information boards described them travelling the seas by, quote, capturing the wind and being guided by the stars, and went on to explain how these people who travelled the Mediterranean region everywhere from the Strait of Gibraltar to Tunisia were responsible for the transfer of ideas all across the region. There was another romantic description of the work of these people, a quotation from Homer, in fact, in which he described a bowl which was offered as a prize by Achilles himself as being, quote, a mixing bowl of chased silver holding 6 pints. It was the loveliest thing in the world, a masterpiece of Sidonian craftsmanship, which had been shipped across the misty seas by Phoenician traders. Another standout part of the exhibition was a selection of coffins originally found near Rabat, human-shaped, made of wood and terracotta and stone and marble. And the last section of the museum is something called the National Numismatic Collection, so coins from every era from the 5th century BC, through which you can see the history of Malta from a different angle. So there you will find Carthaginian and Roman coins, coins from the medieval era, lots and lots of coins from the Order of St. John, and more from the French and British eras afterwards. So another reminder of all the different sorts of peoples who've settled over the centuries on Malta. So that's a brief introduction to 3 aspects of Malta: the art, the architecture and the archaeology, all of which offer insights into the history of the island and the things that you'll see as you're out and about doing your sightseeing. For the next episode, something quite different again, and this time really an episode in 2 halves, so partly on food and partly on festivities, both of which are super important all over the Maltese islands. I'll have a look at some specialities, some restaurants, and attempt to unravel the seemingly never-ending list of days which have to be marked, festivals, excuses for a party, a celebration, lots of colour and light, and definitely lots of fireworks. I challenge you to find a week that you could spend in Valletta any time during the year when there won't be something going on in the way of a festival or a party or a celebration. It's definitely a massive part of their culture. For the meanwhile then, do have a look at the blog if you have a moment. This has been a particularly visual episode, and quite a few of the paintings and buildings and whatnot that I have mentioned will be there for you to have a look at on the blog post. For now though, my Maltese phrasebook to hand, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening and goodbye, which I believe in Maltese might sound roughly like this. Grazie hufna, saha.